So here goes the story. My grandfather lived in a small town, almost a village at the time. The houses were far apart from each other, and everything was surrounded by forest. My grandfather was 18 years old and had just had his first child, Lucas, my uncle, who was a newborn and only a few months old. Only he, my grandmother, and my uncle lived in the house, and the house was a building made of old wood, something my great-grandfather had built and abandoned long ago. Everything went well on the farm and my grandparents always went to Mass on Sundays. The church was approximately 8 kilometers away. One day, a very beautiful woman dressed in a red dress appeared at the Mass. She was a newcomer there, as no one knew her. She was very beautiful, and the priest kept looking at her during Mass. The woman didn't help either. Not only did the dress have a huge neckline, which was rare at the time, she sat in the front row, next to the priest. She was obviously attracted to the young priest as well, and when Mass was over, people left but that woman stayed behind. Soon after, the gossip started. They said she was a prostitute from the capital, and that she was having an affair with the priest. Gramps didn't care about that gossip. A few weeks passed and the full moon arrived. As any newborn, Lucas cried a lot, especially at night. One night Lucas woke up crying and my grandfather went to take care of him. As he nursed him, he heard the clatter of horse hooves outside the house, near Lucas's room. The noise started to get louder, but as soon as it came it was gone, as if that animal was now leaving. Until then, he had no suspicion that this was anything unusual, as both he and some of the neighbors had animals. So, as soon as Lucas calmed down, he went into the kitchen to get some water. Once there, he saw through the kitchen window a light moving quickly through the undergrowth, heading towards the top of the hill of banana trees, a hill completely surrounded by a dense patch of banana trees. He was a little surprised, but there was nothing to do there. The next day the farm animals were strange, and some chickens, piglets and 2 calves were gone. Grandpa connected the dots and thought that light he had seen the day before was a thief fleeing through the woods with the animals. A few days later, some neighbors came to talk to my grandfather and told him that some of their farm animals' cubs had also disappeared. He told the neighbors what he had seen that night. The neighborhood then set up a kind of night watchman, to watch the farms. It would be a person armed with a shotgun and a machete mounted on a horse, patrolling the roads. The neighbors would take turns in that position. The watch began when the full moon ended, and similarly, the robberies stopped. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood calmed down, but the neighborhood decided not to stop with the night watch. As soon as the full moon returned, animal thefts, specifically baby animals, started again. It was a Thursday when my grandfather was on the lookout again. He was on horseback on a dirt road when he saw in the distance the woman in red crossing the road and heading into the undergrowth. He didn't think that was strange, he thought that maybe she lived nearby, and he didn't even notice the fact that the woman was wearing the same red dress as usual. Time passed, and the disappearances of animals continued to happen, always at the time of the full moon. The sightings of the woman in red also continued, especially near my grandfather's house. One day, my grandfather was explaining the situation to his wife, and that's when she said he should find a way to follow her because she heard horse footsteps at night every time the baby cried, especially on nights when there was a full moon. She thought it might be something wanting to take the baby, since the baby animals were also being taken. So on a full moon night, armed with a machete, my grandfather hid in the bushes near the road that led to his house. At a certain point, the woman appeared and continued walking towards the hill of the banana trees. He followed her stealthily, and since it was a full moon he didn't need any lamps to see. Then they reached the top of the hill, a clearing. He watched her through the trees as she walked to the center of the clearing. She started to dig something up, and he soon realized it was a machete. She grabbed her hair and lifted her neck, then used the machete in her other hand to rip her own head off. Her body then bent down and she put her head into the hole where the machete was buried and covered it with earth. With that, the body was engulfed in flames and transformed into the body of a huge reddish horse, but where the head should be, there were only flames. She neighed, making a terrible noise, and then she began to gallop through the woods. My grandfather was silent until he stopped hearing the noise of hooves and neighs, and when he was sure she was far away, he went to the center of the clearing. In the center of the clearing, he dug until he unearthed the woman's head. Her head was bloodied and her eyes were closed. Not knowing what to do, he took out his machete and pierced her head with it. At that moment, he heard a frightening scream. He dropped the head and the machete there and started running. He could hear the gallops and neighs of that being getting closer and closer to him. The creature was heading towards the clearing. He managed to get home and close the door. As soon as he entered, he yelled for his wife to take the child and go to the center of the house, a place that had no windows. The three of them were silent in the dark. Until around 5:30 in the morning, they started to hear that infernal neigh approaching the house. The creature then came close to the house, and started kicking at the door. The fire in its head penetrated through the cracks in the wood as the creature grew more and more desperate. The wood began to catch fire as they prayed that the sun would rise soon. Luckily, the sun rose, and the creature outside went quiet. My grandparents came out through the back of the house, which was now on fire. Unfortunately, there was nothing to be done about the fire, and the house burned down. In front of the house, there was a large pile of ashes where the creature was. This story happened to my grandfather in the 1950s. In my opinion, some of the so-called cryptids used to be around in the old days, mainly in more rural areas. This story is about a specific cryptid, a mule with fire in place of its head that sought infants of all kinds to consume, and thus stay young.